She spent 5 years building her business, a small tavern on the border between kingdom and rebel land. Neutral ground, a place of warmth where anyone could rest safely, until the Alphaking destroyed it. He gave her an ultimatum: turn away the rebels, or lose everything. She refused, so he burned her entire life to the ground with her standing there watching. After that, she swore she would hate him forever. Except fate played the cruelest joke imaginable. When the king is stabbed with a poisoned blade, there's only one person who can save him: her. Now the king is trapped with the woman whose life he ruined. The woman who glares at him every time he speaks. The woman who, somehow, is his mate. And the ruthless Alpha who burned down her entire world has to do the impossible: convince her not to hate him long enough to make her his. Chapter 1. I am here to offer you a choice, the Alphaking said. You will close this establishment to rebel soldiers effective immediately, or face the consequences. Millie stared defiantly back at the man. A man, more than capable of breaking a table in two with a swing of his fist, whose mere presence filled the tavern with an aura so suffocating she could barely breathe. But here in the crossroads, soldier, captain, Alphaking, the title mattered not. This was her kingdom. No, Millie said, crossing her arms. The crossroads is neutral ground, has been for the entirety of the war. The king's eyes narrowed slightly. Millie ignored it. Now, if you want, you're welcome to set yourself down and order a beer like any other customer, she said. But don't just stand there, you're making my customers nervous. The Alphaking sucked on his teeth disapprovingly, glancing around the room. Only minutes before, Millie had been swabbing the bar, humming tunelessly to herself when she heard the telltale clop of hooves. 5 years the crossroads had stood on this rise without incident. The Alphaking's troops and the rebels both respected its status of neutrality, a safe haven in the very heart of the conflict. Until today. Today, the Alphaking, Kenton Kenrath, had marched in and demanded that from here on out, the rebels were no longer welcome in her no-man's land. And as he'd stood there, bold as brass in the middle of her establishment, Millie had felt only a thrill of anger in her gut. She'd poured her blood and sweat into every nail and board of this structure, built it from the ground up with her bare hands. This was her realm, and no Alphaking was going to change that. Is that your final answer? He asked. Yes, Millie lifted her chin deliberately. Their eyes met. Millie refused to look away first. Have it your way, the king said, gesturing dismissively towards his men. Take the rebels outside. The soldiers moved instantly, raging waters released from the dam. Millie rounded the bar. Hands off the clients. Who do you think you are? The woman at the king's shoulder, a commander by rank according to the 3-bar sigil on her chest, stabbed her finger at various individuals. Him, her. 3 men by the fire, a young woman near the back. And, gods no, not Francis, dear gentle Francis, alone by the window. This tavern sits on Crown land, Kenton announced as his men worked around him. We've sent letters by royal decree. You've chosen to ignore them. But this is neutral ground, Millie said, breathing hard. The ground under this roof is mine. The Alphaking contradicted her. Unwritten rules you made up are not law, and it is time to put an end to this charade. Another man was dragged past her, struggling against the hands gripping his shoulders. Millie tried to reach him, but another soldier barred her path. This place has been peaceful for 5 years, Millie's voice rose, trying to push past the soldier who refused to budge. What's it to you who comes here? Do you really believe this place is only used for drinking? The king gave her a disbelieving slant of the eyebrow. Subterfuge and deception, smuggling and fraternizing with the enemy. Francis caught Millie's eye as they dragged him toward the door. He was her regular, 3 years of easy smiles and good tips, the closest to friendship that this place would allow. He gave her a single shake of the head and a finger to his lips before he was hauled out. What is he playing at? Millie thought. She returned her attention to the king. If you've got proof this place is being used for anything else, then show it." "Proof?" Kenton gestured toward the door, where his men were lining rebels up in the courtyard. "If I didn't know any better, I would label you a sympathizer." Millie blanched at the accusation. "I'm not a rebel," she said, her voice tight. "I'm a citizen of—" "Which is why you'll be spared," the king said, and turned, marching out after the guards. After a beat, Millie rushed out after them, boots slipping in the mud. The rebels were being forced to their knees in a rough line, Francis among them. "Spared?" she asked, her voice tight. The first torch touched the east wall of the crossroads. The flame clutched hungrily at the dry timber, climbing fast, and heat pressed against her face. "No!" she shouted. "You were warned," Kenton said quietly. The second wall ignited. Then the third. The soldiers hurried around the house, torches in hand, birthing fire on her pride and joy. Her home. "You can't—" Millie spun toward him, but the words died in her throat. He stood there, emotionless, watching her entire life burn. Every nail, every board, every drop of sweat, up in smoke and flame and ash. She held back her cries of anguish as she watched the flames devour her livelihood whole. The roof groaned. Rafters cracked and fell. The sign above the door, hand-painted in her mother's cobalt blue, split apart. Millie turned her gaze upon the king, who met it without reproach. If there was regret reflected in the flickering orange dancing across his features, it was buried deep. Whilst everyone was focused on the inferno, Francis darted forwards. "No!" Millie screamed, because at that moment she knew that Francis's life was forfeit if he attempted anything. But it was too late. Through the smoke and the chaos and the shouting soldiers, he lunged and drove something small and bright into the king's back. Kenton grunted, twisted, and seized Francis by the throat with one brutal hand, wrenching the blade free with the other. For a heartbeat, Millie thought he would crush Francis's windpipe right there in the mud. But then the king let him go. He staggered backward, dropped to one knee. "The king has been harmed!" someone screamed. Soldiers swarmed Francis, pinning him to the ground. He didn't fight, just fixed Millie with a look, cheek pressed into the mud as if to say, "You're welcome." Millie shook her head, hand over mouth. She couldn't believe this was happening. He gave her a wink. He did not fear death. All fools failed to fear death. Bound and gagged, Francis was frog-marched toward the horses, face streaked with mud and ash. And she could do nothing for him. The sickly, sweet smell wrenched her attention from her friend to the king. The knife dripped with a dark liquid, black as tar. Nightshade. A slow poison, rare, expensive. She could hear her mother's voice in her mind, fatal, especially to shifters. The commander dropped to her knees before him, grasping his shoulders. "Your Majesty?" He didn't answer. The poison was already working through his system. The fact he hadn't yet passed out was impressive, to say the least. "He's been poisoned," Millie said. "Nightshade." The commander's head jerked up, tone hostile. "And how would you know?" "My mother was a healer. He won't make it through the night," she paused and then added, "without proper care." The king's body went slack. The commander caught him, barely, easing him down into the mud. "And your proper care, I suppose," she grunted. "I might be," Millie conceded. "Had he not burned my home down?" Another shudder ran through the king's body. "He's still your king. You have to do something," the commander hissed. Guards came running from the perimeter. One of them dropped beside the king, panic edging into his voice. "We need to get him back to camp." "The healer at the nearest camp is inexperienced," the commander said, staring down at the king's pale face, sweat beading his brow. He groaned, his back arching off the ground, and the seizure hit. His whole body went rigid, shaking violently. The commander rounded on Millie, eyes blazing. "For all we know, you orchestrated this." Millie laughed. "How could I possibly have orchestrated this when I didn't even know he would ever set foot here?" The commander hesitated, looked down at the king, whose seizure had subsided into shallow, ragged breathing. Name your price, healer, she said. Millie didn't hesitate. Francis's freedom, she said. I can't promise you that. The commander's voice was tight. But the king's an honest man. If you save his life, he'll listen to what you have to say at the very least. Millie took one last look at the crossroads. She thought of Francis. If he was all that was left of this place, at least symbolically. She knelt in the mud beside the king and pressed 2 fingers to his throat. His pulse was feeble. All right, she said. I'll do it. Chapter 2. Millie slit the king's coat and shirt open with her belt knife to expose the wound. They bumped along in a makeshift carriage, an open peasant cart, rough-hewn and rattling over the uneven road. The unconscious king sprawled before her kneeling form. The commander sat with his head in her lap, watching Millie's every move closely, one hand always poised on the pommel of her sword. Carefully, Millie pressed her fingers to the edges of the wound. They'd brought her fresh water to wash her hands prior to mounting the wagon, but she was missing her bag of herbs, burned down with the crossroads. Applying pressure, she began to draw the first round of poison out. Black fluid seeped from the puncture, viscous and foul. Will he live? The commander asked, her voice tight. The king's breathing was shallow, ragged. Too soon to tell, Millie said. She pressed down harder, coaxing more of the poison free, hands moving over his bare skin. And as she worked, something strange unfurled in her chest. A delicate warmth that settled beneath her ribs, spreading outward like heat from a hearth. A nameless fire that spread and spread and spread. It was with great effort that she cast the feeling aside. The only thing that required her concentration was saving Francis. And to do that, she had to keep the king alive. That was all that mattered. By the time they reached the encampment, she had bled the worst of the poison and put together a slapdash compress on the wound. She would need herbs to treat the wound further. Soldiers scuttled between the rows like ants. Banners bearing the king's crest snapped in the wind. As the cart rolled to a stop and the commander started to wave soldiers across to help the king, Millie grasped her forearm. Francis, she said. Where is he? The commander, Hilda, one of the soldiers had called her, shrugged off her hand irritably. Alive. If the king lives, he'll stay that way. Until his trial. Hilda hopped down and began to coordinate the soldiers into carefully carrying their lord from the wagon and onto a stretcher. I want to see him, Millie insisted. No. Hilda's tone left no room for argument. Remember the deal. Millie's jaw tightened. They carried the king into the largest tent at the center of the camp and laid him on a cot. On the way, Millie listed the herbs and supplies she would need. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, checking the king's temperature, cleaning the wound, watching for signs of further seizure. The camp's healer, a young man who looked like he still belonged in school, took over for a few hours so she could rest. When she returned to the king that evening, the wound had been cleaned and dressed. She could see the careful work of the camp healer in the neat bandaging, the way the edges had been packed with the poultice she'd described. Perhaps there was more to the kid than he let on. She knelt beside the cot and examined the skin around the wound, running her fingers lightly over the inflamed edges. A hand grabbed hers. Millie startled, her eyes snapping up. The king was awake. He was watching her, those warm brown eyes struggling to focus. He didn't say anything, just stared, probably trying to make sense of where he was and what was happening. Eventually, the vice eased on her hand and released her. I'm going to continue inspecting your wound, she said, keeping her voice level. She saw him frown, but he let her continue her work. When her fingers made contact with his bare skin again, the warmth that had assailed her in the wagon bloomed in her chest once more. She shoved it down. She felt him shiver beneath her touch, though his skin was warm to the touch. You're the woman from the bar? He asked after a moment. What are you doing? Baking a cake, Millie said without looking up. The king was silent, as if seriously considering her claim. You've been poisoned, Millie supplied helpfully. Poisoned? He asked. She nodded. Unfamiliar with the concept? No, I got that much, Kenton said gruffly. He went back to watching her. It unnerved Millie slightly. When he sat up with a grunt, she put her hand on his leg to still him. Don't move, she said. There's still poison in your system. You need to remain calm. There was a pause. He cleared his throat. Another pause. He cleared his throat again. The tavern, he managed finally. It was a necessary measure. He said it all clipped. Formal. As if reading from a script. He hadn't even apologized. Not really. Millie said nothing. The king cleared his throat again. I will see to it you are compensated when the campaign allows, he insisted. She met his eyes then. That won't be necessary, she said. He searched her face. Then what do you want? He asked. If you're hell-bent on compensation, I ask only for the life of the man who poisoned you. Spare him. The king blinked. He's in your custody now, she continued. I cannot do that, he said. And there was no cruelty in it. He's a rebel. A traitor to the crown. He deliberately tried to kill me. Out of misplaced loyalty for me, Millie said, her voice rising. Because you burned down my tavern. The king's jaw clenched. If I let this man off scot-free, I am giving license to all would-be assassins out there to take a pot at me. Millie made an ugly sound. I'm done for today, she said sharply. Move as much as you want. Hopefully the poison will spread faster that way. She made for the tent entrance, but his hand shot out and caught her wrist, pulling her back. If you want to be angry, Kenton said, his eyes fixed on hers. You can yell if you want to. It stunned her. She was angry, furious. But if he asked for it, she would deny him it. He deserved nothing of what he asked for. Your fever will spike tonight, she said, twisting her wrist free. Get one of the other healers to deal with it. Then she ducked out of the tent and did not look back. Outside, the evening air was cool against her flushed face. As she strode, a realization struck her. It wasn't just for Francis that she was helping the king. It was out of spite. She would not let him escape what he'd done by simply dying. He was going to live. And he was going to look at her every day and live with it. Then she thought of that warmth in her chest when she'd touched the king's skin, and she kicked a stone on the path hard enough to send it skittering into the dark. Chapter 3. By the end of the first week, Millie knew where the clean water was stored, which healers were competent and which of the junior officers would stand aside for her in a narrow path when others would make her step into the mud. She also knew that her anger, although less likely to explode, was sitting right at the pit of her stomach, as if awaiting the right trigger. The nightshade was responding to treatment, albeit slower than she'd expected. King Kenton's fever broke each afternoon and returned each night, climbing higher as the sun set. She built a dosage schedule around the rhythm. During those first 3 days, the king did not try to speak to her again. Each time she tended to his bandages, he would sit in silence and watch her. Their second proper conversation occurred 3 days into this routine. The silence was broken only by the grind of mortar and pestle in her hands and the rustle of wind on the tent flaps. Until, you're still here. His voice split the tenuous peace. Looks like the poison hasn't affected your eyesight, she replied. A beat of silence. Is that a possibility? He asked. She glanced up then, meeting his gaze. If the patient talks too much, yes. She shrugged. She watched him without the inkling of a smile. His own expression remained blank. Then I will do my best to speak as seldom as possible, he conceded. After another short pause, he added, Is there anything I can do to speed up the process? Millie leaned forward slightly. Proper motivation would help. The life of your king isn't sufficient? She gave him a withering look and his mouth twitched slightly, something between a smile and a grimace. You're still hoping I'll spare your rebel friend, he guessed. Just because he happens to be from beyond the border does not make him a rebel, Millie said sharply. Believe it or not, most people don't care about your war nor want to be part of it. We have more interest in living than killing. He watched her for a long moment. "I understand you feel that way," he said, and he sounded sincere. She grunted dismissively, concentrating on blending herbs. "But I don't have the luxury to feel that way," he finished. Millie rolled her eyes. "Peace isn't a luxury," she said, "and neither is mercy." He sighed, then leaned back slightly against the pillows. "Did you know?" he said carefully. "The Crossroads wasn't just a tavern to my intelligence officers." "It was to me," Millie said, not looking up from her work. "For 6 months, we tracked rebel communications through the border zone," Kenton continued. "Messages passed through your tavern. Operatives sheltered there between missions. Supply routes were coordinated under your roof." "Yeah, so people talked," Millie said flatly. "That's what happens in taverns." "Coordinated." He corrected her, his voice patient, measured. "We documented the pattern. Rebel soldiers arriving on specific nights. Leaving before dawn, the same faces, the same routes. Specific nights." The words wormed into her mind despite herself. Same faces, same routes. No. She refused to let him rewrite what the Crossroads had been. What it had meant. "My tavern was neutral ground," Millie snapped. "It doesn't matter what they were doing. That's the whole point of neutral territory. Your own troops were also discussing their plans, I'm sure. My tavern was a haven for everyone." Kenton sighed heavily. "And I'm grateful my boys had somewhere safe to rest," he said. "But that doesn't change what the rebels were using it for." He watched her cutting fresh bandages, her movements sharper, angrier. "I sent letters," he said, trying a different tack. "Sure, 3 of them," she quipped, the scissors snapping through fabric with more force than necessary. "Ordering me to close my doors to half my customers. Warning you," he corrected, "that if you continued to allow—" "I didn't allow anything," she snapped. "I served beer, that was all." The king's eyes narrowed. "You refused to choose a side," he accused. "Because there shouldn't have to be sides," Millie sighed. "Not in every corner of this kingdom. Not in every building and every conversation. Some places should be allowed to just exist without your war crawling into them." He was quiet for a moment. "I made the call I would have made for any such asset in the border zone," Kenton said, and this was the moment she stopped cutting entirely. "And I stand by the calculation, even if I regret the cost." Millie put the scissors down. 5 years of her life. Every nail she'd hammered, every stranger she'd sheltered, every moment of peace she'd managed to carve out of her work, and he'd surmised her home into an asset. "Do you believe," she asked quietly, her knuckles white against the edge of the table, "that telling me the math makes it better?" He hesitated. Seeing the full picture always helps come to a logical conclusion. "Right. So the full picture is supposed to make me agree with you?" she asked, something dangerous creeping into her voice. "Or make me understand that my disagreement doesn't matter?" He flinched. "I'm not just a number that can be paid off to keep her mouth shut with a smile on her face," Millie said, the words coming out harder than she intended, but she didn't soften them. "And I won't be thanking you for explaining my own loss to me." Silence stretched between them. She expected him to bristle, to argue, to remind her of his authority or his crown or any of the 100 ways a king could shut down dissent. Instead, "I was only trying to help you understand," he said quietly. "Which is not the same as asking you to forgive." The sincerity in his voice only made it worse. She didn't want his understanding. She wanted her tavern back. She wanted Francis free. She wanted this conversation to stop burrowing under her skin like a splinter she couldn't dig out. "Neither matter," Millie growled. She redressed the wound swiftly, wrapping the fresh bandage with quick, practiced movements. "Millie." Her eyes snapped to his. It was the first time he had called her by her name. "You're not just a number," he said, not unkindly. His hand took hers, large and calloused and surprisingly gentle. The warmth bloomed again in her chest, at such odds with the anger that erupted right beneath it. For a split second, she felt the urge to lean into that touch, to let the weight of the past week drain away. Then reality crashed back. This was the man who'd burned everything, who'd reduced her life to an asset and a calculation. She snarled, snapping her hand back. "Don't touch me." She turned away, gathering her supplies hurriedly, dropping a bouquet of rosemary on the floor in her haste. "How do I fix it?" he asked. She stopped. Did not look back. "I told you," she said. "Spare Francis." Then she left. She sent a camp healer with written instructions that evening instead of returning. "How do I fix it?" he'd asked, as if he genuinely wanted an answer to mend this rift. Kings really lived in a different world, burning people's livelihoods down without a second thought, then believing that it could all be rectified with a simple, "sorry." She plucked angrily at the stray grass upon which she sat. But his words kept circling back, unwelcome and persistent. Specific nights, same routes, coordinated. She thought of Francis. Had she been willfully blind or just naive? No. She shook her head sharply. The crossroads had been neutral ground. What people did with that neutrality wasn't her responsibility. Her fingers twisted in the grass, pulling hard enough to uproot a clump. But the unease sat heavy in her stomach alongside the anger, and neither one would let her rest. At dawn, she went back. Something felt wrong the moment she ducked through the tent flap. The air was too hot, too close. The brazier burned low, but the heat radiating from the cot was stifling. He was feverish and unconscious when she entered, his breathing shallow and uneven. The young camp healer looked up, relief flooding his face the moment he saw her. "His fever spiked an hour ago," he said. "I did what you wrote, but—" "Go," Millie said. The healer left. She dropped to her knees beside the cot, her kit hitting the ground with a thud. Her hands went to his forehead first, burning, far hotter than it should be. Hotter than it had been even at the worst points earlier in the week. What happened, she wondered. The bandage was clean, no signs of fresh infection. But the fever, gods, the fever shouldn't have spiked like this. She dipped a cloth in cool water and began to work, wiping down his face, his neck, his chest, the way she did on nights when the fever climbed too high. You shouldn't have left, she told herself. You knew he needed monitoring. Kenton's head turned slightly, a low sound catching in his throat. Not quite conscious, but aware enough to register discomfort. You'll be fine, she said, quieter than she meant to. I'm here now. Her anger was still there, coiled tight beneath her ribs. But layered over it now was something sharper and more immediate. Guilt. And beneath that, quieter but impossible to ignore, worry. Chapter 4. The king's fever hadn't improved by morning. You're supposed to save him, Hilda said accusingly as Millie set her kit down. Nightshade isn't easy to shake, she replied levelly. And I still haven't even gotten to see Francis yet. Hilda drew herself to full height at the counter-accusation, but Millie didn't back down. Let me see him, she negotiated. Hilda's mouth pressed into a thin line. Fine. Millie permitted herself the smallest of smiles of triumph as she bent her head and got back to work. Keep the fire low, she said to Hilda without looking up. And the water cold. Hilda grunted. Pressing 2 fingers to Kenton's wrist, she counted the beats in his pulse. But was instantly distracted by that strange pull again, as if there were an invisible cord linking her to him, threading through her chest and settling burning and insistent beneath her ribs. She forced herself to concentrate, watching the flutter of his pulse beneath his skin. She released his wrist. Instantly, Kenton gasped in a wet, rattling breath, back arching. Millie frowned, confused, and checked his pulse again. It was racing once more, but as she held onto it, the pull returned. The warmth bloomed. His pulse steadied. She stared at her own hand, then back at him. At the fever flush across his cheekbones. The way his chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. "What in the world?" she whispered. She dropped his wrist again, standing, hand to her chest. The moment she released him, Kenton started to writhe again. "What are you doing?" Hilda demanded nervously. Millie was too frightened to reply, not by the fever or the king's condition, but by this strange, magnetic tug between them. What did it all mean? She was at a loss to explain. And before Millie could find the words, Kenton gasped awake, eyes bulging and unfocused, strong fingers clutching into the straw of his mattress. Their eyes met. His gaze was wild, unseeing, lost somewhere between fever and consciousness. "Your Majesty," Millie murmured, uncertain. His fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength for someone so weakened. And then, his lips pressed against her knuckles. Heat flooded through Millie, sharp, startling, completely unbidden. Then he turned her hand over, mouth finding the pulse point at her wrist, lingering there. Her breath caught. She could feel the way his breath came in ragged bursts against her wrist. The pull between them flared so bright it almost hurt. She needed to pull away. But she was frozen, staring at the king of the realm pressing his mouth to her skin. "Stay," he breathed, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of a plea. Millie's thoughts scattered like startled birds. This means nothing. He's delirious. He doesn't know what he's doing. But her body didn't seem to care about logic. She was acutely aware of every point of contact, the heat of him radiating through the thin space between them. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reprised her seat beside him and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, trying to steady her breathing. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, a small, involuntary sound catching in his throat. It was the sound of a man who had not let anyone take care of him in a very long time. She hated it. Hated the way that sound made her feel. Hated the way her hand lingered a second longer than necessary against his jaw, her thumb unconsciously stroking the sharp line of his cheekbone. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "He burned down your home." But her hand stayed where it was. The fever broke in the gray hour before dawn. First his breathing evened. Then the trembling stopped. Then his eyes opened, clearer than they'd been in hours. Millie was still sitting beside him, her hand resting on his wrist. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse. "You asked me to," she said, pulling her hand back quickly. His eyes followed the movement, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then he turned his gaze up to the tent ceiling, watching how the winds rippled across the canvas. For a long while he was silent. "My father died 3 years ago," he said finally. "Mid-campaign. I was 26. Millie glanced at him and said nothing. But almost without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand back on his wrist. To monitor his pulse, she told herself. The moment her skin touched his, something shifted. The pull flared, but it was different this time. Not just warmth, but feeling. "He left me a war," Kenton continued. "No plan. Just unfinished business and a council full of men twice my age who expected me to know what I was doing." A wash of emotion that wasn't hers crashed over her like a wave. Grief. Bone deep and exhausting. The weight of it made her chest constrict. Millie's breath hitched. She could feel him, not just the physical warmth of his skin, but the roiling emotions beneath. "The first year, I made decisions I can't look straight at now." His voice was emotionless, but she could feel the truth of it thrumming through her palm. Self-loathing. Regret. "I thought being decisive was the same as being right." The emotions kept coming, washing over her in waves. She could feel how alone he'd been. "No one was allowed to ask me how I was doing," he continued, still staring at the ceiling. "Not Hilda, not the council. Asking for help was weakness." He turned his head slightly to look at her then. "It's not easy, carrying the weight of a kingdom alone because that's what everyone expects." He paused, and something softened in his expression. "I'd imagine it was the same as having a tavern, just on a much larger scale." The comparison was so unexpected that Millie's breath caught. "And I burned it down," the king added. "I burned down your tavern." She said nothing to that, but her fingers tightened slightly on his wrist. He closed his eyes, and after a few moments he kept going. "I killed 200 men in the first month. Sent them into a valley." His voice was barely above a whisper. "My father's generals swore it was clear. Safe passage to the eastern border. But the rebels were waiting." He paused. "My men were slaughtered." The shame hit her like a physical blow. The guilt. The weight of 200 lives lost because he'd trusted the wrong people. "I didn't know what I was doing," he said. "But I just kept going. Kept making decisions. Some of them were right. Some of them—" He trailed off. She could feel the exhaustion in him. Years of carrying impossible weight, of making impossible choices. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. He opened his eyes, and for a moment he just looked at her. "I don't know," he admitted, and she felt the truth of it. He fell asleep a few minutes later, his breathing evening out, the lines of tension in his face finally smoothing. Millie sat beside him for a long time, her hand still resting on his wrist, feeling the steady beat of his pulse and the echo of emotions that weren't quite hers. "I want to see Francis," she said eventually. She needed distance, needed to remember why she was here. Even as her heart beat too fast and her skin still tingled where they'd touched. Kenton's dark eyes searched her face. Then he nodded. "You've earned that much at least," he said. Chapter 5. The stockade sat at the edge of camp, a cluster of rough wooden posts driven into the ground with iron chains strung between them. Guards stood at intervals, alert and regularly rotated. Hilda led Millie through the perimeter and stopped before a figure slumped against one of the posts at the very far end. Francis. He was chained by the wrists and ankles, his clothes torn and muddy, his face swollen on one side. They'd beaten him, often by the looks of it. The bruises along his jaw were a mottled mix of healing yellow and green and fresh black and blue. Millie's chest tightened as she knelt before her friend. 3 years. 3 years of easy conversation and terrible jokes, and the way he'd always left an extra coin on the bar when he thought she wasn't looking. And now he was here, broken and bleeding because of her. "You've got 10 minutes, Hilda said, then stepped away to give them space. "Gods, Francis, what have they done to you?" Millie started to tend to his eyebrow whilst Hilda's back was turned. Francis looked up with a wince, and despite everything, despite the bruises and the chains and the guards watching from 20 paces away, he smiled. That same lopsided smile he'd given her 1,000 times across the bar at the crossroads. "Millie," he said, sighing with relief. "You're in one piece." The warmth in his voice nearly undid her. "And you're in pieces," she replied, managing to keep her voice steady. She glanced at the guards, then back at him, dabbing carefully at the cut. "This is absurd. You're not even a rebel, not even their enemy." "It's what they do," Francis interrupted gently, and there was something in his tone. A weariness, maybe, or resignation that made her pause. "You shouldn't have done it," she said quietly. "Stabbing the king. What were you thinking? Once he recovers fully, I hope to make him see reason, but—" Francis winced. "I couldn't just sit there and watch whilst he burned down your home." Her throat tightened. Your home. Not the tavern or the crossroads. He understood what it had meant to her, what it had cost her. Still, though, throwing your life away on something that was already going to happen? Not very smart, she said. It didn't bring the crossroads back, Francis. All it did was land you here. He deserved it, Francis snapped. After what he did to you. Yes, it was awful, granted. Millie pressed harder than necessary on the wound. But what you did was reckless. You could have just walked away. found safety beyond the border. But instead There are some things you just can't walk away from quietly, Francis interrupted, and when she finally looked up, his eyes were fixed on hers and it made her pause. He meant her. He'd done this for her. Millie's hands stilled. "I'm trying to negotiate for your freedom," she said after a moment, her voice softer now. "I've been treating the king, saving his life, in exchange for yours." Francis's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked like the man she'd known. The one who'd teased her about her terrible singing while she cleaned glasses, who'd helped her fix the broken shutter without being asked. "Thank you, Millie." He paused, and something hopeful flickered across his bruised features. "If you do manage to negotiate my freedom, I want you to come with me. We'll rebuild in a safer place, beyond the border. Somewhere the king's reach doesn't extend." Millie considered it. A fresh start. Somewhere far from burned taverns and impossible kings and strange pulls she couldn't explain. Somewhere she could rebuild what she'd lost, with someone who understood what it had meant. She had nowhere else to go. The crossroads was ash, her savings with it. She had no family, no home, no plan. And the lure of neutral territory where this war could not touch was all the argument she needed to convince her. "How can you even be sure they'll let me in beyond the border?" she asked. Francis smiled faintly. "I've got contacts there, people who owe me. You'd be safe, I promise." Safe. The word wrapped around her like a blanket. When was the last time she'd felt safe? Millie found herself smiling back, small but genuine. "You always did have a knack for knowing people." "Learned from the best bartender in the borderlands," he smiled. "We done here?" Hilda appeared at her elbow again, shattering the moment. Millie stood, reluctantly. "I'll see what I can do," she told Francis, who gave her another wink, slower, more painful than usual, but still him. "Take your time. I'm beginning to like it here," he joked half-heartedly. Despite everything, Millie felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "Liar!" As she left him, his words echoed in her mind. "Come with me." A future, a way forward. And so, later that afternoon, she returned to Kenton's tent to check on his wound. She ducked through the entrance and froze. He was sitting up when she entered, propped against the pillows, looking stronger than he had in days. His dark hair was still damp, like he'd recently washed, and he'd changed into a clean shirt that hung open at the collar. When he saw her, he smiled. It was only a smile. And yet, his whole face transformed, the hard edges softening, those brown eyes crinkling at the corners, and Millie's heart jolted in her chest. Heat bloomed again beneath her ribs, so much more powerfully than before. Stop it right now," she told herself. "You look wonderful," Millie said quickly. Too quickly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Heat flooded her cheeks. "I mean, you look better. I'll check on you later." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Millie." Just her name. Just that. But the way he said it made her chest tighten. "I should go," she murmured. "You need rest." "Wait." He stood, and she heard the rustle of fabric, the soft sound of his boots on the ground. "There's something I need to tell you." "I also need to ask you something," she said quickly, before she could lose her nerve. Before she could turn around and do something stupid like notice how broad his shoulders were, or how his shirt hung open just enough to show the hollow of his throat. She forced herself to turn, to face him, and immediately regretted it. He was closer than she'd thought. And he was watching her with an emotion she couldn't name. "All right," he said warmly. Millie took a breath, trying to focus on Francis, on freedom, on anything but the way Kenton was looking at her. "Let Francis go," she said. "Please. Once you've recovered fully, just let him go." The softness vanished from his face, His expression closed like a door slamming shut. "I can't," he said. "Why not?" Millie asked. "You said if I saved your life, you'd listen to what I had to say. I'm asking you to spare him." "And I've listened," Kenton said, his own voice hardening to match hers. "But I cannot free him. Not until the war is over. Not while he's still a threat." "He's not a threat!" Millie argued, stepping closer despite herself, anger propelling her forward. "He's a man who made a stupid decision out of misplaced loyalty. He's not your enemy." "He's a rebel," Kenton said flatly. Millie froze. "No," she said, shaking her head. "He's not. He's from beyond the border, yes, but that doesn't make him—" "He is," Kenton repeated, and something like pity flickered across his face. "We've known for months." "You're lying," she snapped, heat flooding through her. "You think everyone who doesn't fight for you is a rebel. You thought I was one too." "I never thought you were a rebel," Kenton said, his voice quiet but firm. He took a step toward her, and she took a step back. "I thought your tavern was being used by them." "Which it was. Primarily by your friend, Francis." Millie shook her head violently. "He came to the crossroads to drink, to rest, to pass messages," Kenton interrupted, still advancing slowly. "To coordinate supply routes." Her back hit the tent pole. Kenton stopped a foot away. She could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "We documented it, Millie," he said. "For 6 months. He holds the rank of coordinator in the Compact's intelligence network. He used your neutrality as cover." "He wouldn't do that." She drew herself to full height, lifting her chin defiantly even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm sorry," Kenton took another step closer. "But that's the truth. That pull. That warmth she'd been trying to ignore for days. It flared, sudden and overwhelming. Not just warmth now, but heat, liquid and insistent, pooling low in her belly. She saw the exact moment Kenton felt it too. His eyes widened slightly, pupils dilating. His breathing hitched, his chest rising and falling faster. The air between them crackled. "Millie," he said, his voice rough and low. "Don't," she whispered, but it came out breathless, unconvincing. But he was already moving, and so was she. And she didn't know who closed the distance first. Only that suddenly his hand was cupping her face, and her fingers were twisted in his shirt, pulling him closer even as her mind screamed at her to stop. Their mouths met in the space between them. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, fierce, all the anger and confusion and want she'd been burying for days rising to the surface in a rush. His lips were hot and demanding against hers, and she matched him with equal intensity. His other hand found her waist, pulling her flush against him, and she gasped at the contact. The solid warmth of his body, the strength in his arms, the way he held her. Her hands slid up his chest, feeling the hard muscle beneath the fabric, and he groaned against her mouth, a low sound that she felt vibrate through her entire body. His hand on her face tilted her head, changing the angle, and the kiss went deeper. Hungrier and... Reality crashed back in. "What am I doing?" She shoved him away with both hands, stumbling backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she gasped, her chest heaving. "No, Millie!" Kenton reached for her, his eyes dark and intense. "Don't touch me!" She backed toward the tent entrance, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. I have to go." "Wait." Kenton's voice was commanding, edged with something desperate, and she froze despite herself. "You feel it, don't you? The pull." She didn't answer. Her thoughts were spinning, her body still humming with the aftermath of the kiss. "You do," he said quietly, taking a careful step toward her. "You've been feeling it since the first time you touched me. I know you have." "I don't know what you're talking about," she attempted. "You're my mate," Kenton said. A terrible silence hung between them. Millie stared at him, her mind going blank. "I'm what?" "The bond between us," he said, stepping closer. "It's a mating bond. It happens between shifters and their fated partners. You feel the pull because we're bound, destined." "No." She shook her head violently. "That's not possible. That doesn't happen to humans." "It's rare," Kenton admitted, his eyes never leaving hers. "But not impossible." "You're lying." Her voice broke. "This is just another way to control me, to take away my choice." "I would never take away your choice," he protested, looking hurt. "You already have," she shouted. "You took my home. You imprisoned my friend who is innocent, and now you're telling me I'm bound to you whether I want it or not." "Millie." His voice was gentle, but there was pain in it. "I swear to you, on my crown, on my life, I will not force you into anything. The bond exists. I can't change that. But what we do about it is still your choice." She couldn't think. The taste of him was still on her lips, the feel of his hands still burning on her skin. Before he could say another word, she ducked out of the tent and into the cold afternoon air. She went straight to the stockade, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Hilda tried to stop her, but Millie pushed past without a word, ignoring the commander's protests. She found Francis exactly where she'd left him, chained and bruised, and she dropped to her knees in the mud in front of him. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice shaking. Francis looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "Millie?" "What?" "Are you a rebel?" she demanded. "Did you use my tavern? Did you use me?" His expression closed. And she knew. The warmth she'd felt earlier, the hope of a future together. It all curdled in her stomach. He shrugged helplessly, and she could see the guilt in his eyes. "I'm sorry." Her voice cracked. "You're sorry?" "I never wanted to stand against the king. I just wanted to be neutral. You knew that, and you used me anyway." "Neutrality wasn't an option," Francis said, his voice hard. "It never was. You're more than naive if you ever thought it was a choice." Millie recoiled as if she'd been struck. Naive. The word echoed in her head, mixing with Kenton's voice saying asset and calculation. Everyone had used her. The rebels. The crown. Even the people she'd thought were friends. "Millie, wait!" Francis started, but she was already turning away. "Please, just listen." But she didn't stop. She ran. Chapter 6. Millie didn't leave her tent for 2 days. She told herself it was because the king had almost recovered and no longer required her constant attention. The camp healers could more than manage on their own from here on in. She'd saved his life as promised, and that was the end of the matter. But the truth was harder to face. She wrapped herself in her cloak, seated on the edge of the cot, staring at nothing, vapor fogging the air before her lips. The tent was small, barely large enough for a cot and a trunk, but it was quiet. Cold, too. A snap had come down off the hills, turning the air crisp. Her thoughts swirled in absolute turmoil. Francis was a rebel. The crossroads had never been the neutral ground she had believed it to be. And she was bound to the man who'd burned it all down. She could leave, of course. The guard that had been posted on her first few nights had been removed, so clearly no one saw her as a prisoner. If she'd wanted to, she could have walked out of this camp, head to a distant horizon in any given direction, and start over. But as what? Before the crossroads, Millie had lived a life on the road. She and her mother had been traveling healers then, moving from settlement to settlement, offering what help they could. The war had already been raging for years by that point, turning the borderlands into a patchwork of contested territory where violence erupted without warning. They'd been tending to a farmer's infected leg when the skirmish broke out in the town square. Rebel forces, crown soldiers. Millie never learned which side struck first, and it hadn't mattered. Her mother had been hit by a stray crossbow bolt, a glancing gash across her shoulder. They'd cleaned it, dressed it, and moved on. The fever came 3 days later. By the time they reached the next settlement, her mother was delirious, burning up, the wound festering despite everything Millie tried. She'd used every herb she knew, every technique her mother had taught her, but the infection had spread too fast, sunk too deep. Her mother died in a stranger's barn, whispering inanities. The war had taken everything from her. Millie had used what little money they'd saved to buy the crossroads. A failing tavern no one else wanted, in a location everyone else avoided. She'd rebuilt it board by board, brewed the first ale herself, scrubbed blood and ash from the floors until her hands bled. And she'd given people something the war hadn't, a place to breathe, a place where the fighting stopped at the door. She'd helped people, given them refuge and comfort, given them a space where they could remember what it felt like to be human. But had her idealism made her naive? Frances thought so. The king thought so. Maybe everyone did. Maybe she'd been the only one who believed neutrality was possible. Someone cleared their throat at the tent flap. "Who is it?" Millie called, not moving from the cot. Hilda ducked inside, looking stiff. "Thought you should know." The king commuted the execution order. Millie's head snapped up. "What?" "Your friend, Francis," Hilda said. "He'll remain a prisoner until the war ends, but he won't hang. The king made the order official this morning." Millie stared at her. "Why?" Hilda's mouth twitched. "You'd have to ask him that. Though I can tell you his council wasn't pleased. Neither was I, for that matter. The man tried to kill him. This will invite more attempts on his life, mark my words." "Then why did he do it?" "Like I said, ask him yourself." She turned to go, hesitated, then added, "Just thought you should know." She left. Millie sat very still, her mind racing. Kenton had spared Francis. Not freed by any means, but his life was safe for now. Relief flooded through her, mixed with a boatload of confusion. The king had taken the decision based on her plea. He had listened to her. She felt that tug in her heart, that warmth. What he'd referred to as the bond. Burying her head in her arms, she closed her eyes tight and tried to chase all feeling away. She didn't know how to feel about anything anymore. By the third day, she'd made her decision to leave. The king was recovering. She'd double-checked with the camp healer that morning, casually, as if she didn't care. His fever was gone. The wound was clean. He'd be back on his feet within the week. Her work here was done. She had nowhere to go, no plans. But staying here, near him, and that disorienting pull she couldn't explain and didn't want, near the ruins of everything she'd thought she understood, would be impossible. So, once the decision was made, she packed her kit, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped out of the tent. The camp was busy, soldiers moving between the rows, supply wagons being loaded and unloaded. No one stopped her. She ignored the tug in her chest. She passed the last row of tents, the sentry posts coming into view ahead. Beyond them, open road. The tug was starting to ache. She paused, took in a deep breath. She knew what she was doing. This was for the best. She took another step. A hand clamped over her mouth, an arm locked around her waist, dragging her sideways into the trees. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled. She drove her elbow back hard, felt it connect with ribs, heard a grunt of pain. But the grip held fast. Another figure stepped out of the trees ahead of her. A woman, scarred and sharp-eyed, wearing the rough leathers of a border fighter. A rebel. "Millie Voss," the woman said. "You're coming with us." Chapter 7. Millie woke to rough voices and the smell of damp earth. Her head throbbed. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back with coarse rope. She was sitting against a tree, the bark digging into her spine, and when she tried to move, a wave of dizziness washed over her. "She's awake," someone said. The scarred woman from before crouched in front of her. Up close, Millie could see the network of scars across her face. A fighter who'd survived more battles than most. "My name is Romaine," the woman said. "And you're going to help us get Francis back." Millie's vision cleared slowly. They were in a clearing somewhere in the woods. Half a dozen rebels stood scattered around the perimeter, watchful and alert. "You're going to exchange me for him," Millie said, her voice hoarse. "Smart girl," Romaine smiled without warmth. "Among other demands, safe passage to the border, supplies, a formal ceasefire for the Northern Territories." "He won't agree to that," Millie said. "He will if he wants you back alive." "You don't understand," Millie said, forcing herself to focus through the pounding in her skull. "I know Kenton. He won't negotiate under threat." "So, he'll just let you die?" Romaine's smile widened. "We'll see." The exchange was set for noon at a clearing half a mile from the camp. Millie was hauled to her feet and marched through the trees, Romaine's hand tight on her arm. The rebels organized themselves accordingly. Archers in the trees, fighters along the tree line, ready to scatter or strike depending on how things went. They dragged her into the center of the clearing and forced her to her knees. And then they waited. The sun climbed higher. Millie's knees ached against the hard ground. Her wrists burned where the rope had rubbed them raw. She gritted her teeth and held her tongue and waited. Somehow, somewhere deep down in her gut, she felt him coming before she saw him. Seconds later, Kenton stepped out of the trees. Millie's breath caught. He was still pale and moved stiffly and hardly looked in shape for combat. His commander, Hilda, walked at his shoulder, hand on her sword hilt. And between them, hands bound but seemingly unharmed, was Francis. Kenton's eyes found Millie's across the distance, and something fierce and protective blazed in them. The bond surged in her chest, sharp and insistent. "Your Majesty," Romaine called out. "How good of you to come in person." "Release her," Kenton said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "And we'll talk." "Oh, we'll talk," Romaine said. "But first, let's discuss terms. We want Francis released, safe passage to the border for all of us, supplies, food, medicine, weapons, and a formal ceasefire in the Northern Territories for 6 months." "Not happening," Kenton said flatly. Romaine gestured, and one of the rebels grabbed Millie by the hair, yanking her head back. A knife appeared at her throat. Millie's heart hammered, but she forced herself to stay still. "Let's try this again," Romaine said. "We want—" "I heard you the first time," Kenton interrupted. His eyes hadn't left Millie's. "You don't negotiate by putting a blade to someone's throat. That's not negotiation, that's blackmail." Romaine laughed. "You burn villages, execute prisoners. You spend years grinding us into the mud, and you want to talk about playing dirty?" "I want to talk about ending this war," Kenton said, taking a cautious step forward. "But not like this. Let's talk like civilized people." The knife pressed harder against Millie's throat. She felt the cold edge of it, the sting as it broke skin. Kenton's nostrils flared and he took another violent step forward before Hilda grabbed his shoulder and held him back. Romaine's eyes narrowed, flicking from the Alphaking to Millie and back again. "What have we here?" she cooed with a triumphant chuckle. "Has the Ickle-Wickle King found himself a pet?" She eyed them more closely, ran the knife in aimless circles down Millie's neck, taking in her flushed cheeks, her heightened breathing. "She wouldn't be your mate, would she?" Romaine let that sit between them for a few seconds before she burst out laughing. "I wondered why you came yourself instead of sending someone expendable." She leaned closer to Millie. "Does he know you feel it too?" Millie said nothing. "Let her go," Kenton said, and there was a tremor in his voice, barely controlled fury. "And I'll give you Francis. No other conditions. Just let her go." "And the rest of our demands?" "We can discuss them," Kenton said. "After you release her." Francis, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Romaine, let her go. She's not part of this." "She became part of this the moment the king decided she mattered to him," Romaine smiled sweetly. "She's a civilian," Francis said, his voice rising. "You want to spill innocent blood too?" Romaine hesitated, and in that moment, Kenton made his move. "I'll negotiate," he said clearly. "A real negotiation. For a peace treaty. Not a ceasefire, a treaty. Representatives from both sides, neutral ground, terms that both of us can live with." He paused. "But only if you let Millie go. Right now." The clearing went silent. Romaine stared at him. "You can't be serious." "We bleed each other dry, and for what? Pride? Territory that's been scorched beyond recognition?" He looked at Francis. "You wanted the borderlands to be safe. I want the kingdom to be whole. Maybe there's a way to give us both what we need." Francis looked stunned. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll back that. A real treaty. My people will listen if I tell them it's worth it." Romaine looked between them, then down at Millie. "Fine," she said finally. She gestured, and the knife pulled back from Millie's throat. "Send Francis over, and she's yours." Kenton nodded to Hilda, who cut Francis's bonds and gave him a shove forward. Francis walked across the clearing slowly, hands raised, shock but hope in his eyes. Millie was hauled to her feet, her bonds sliced, and shoved forward. She started to cross as well. She caught Francis's eyes, and he gave her a wink. She chanced a smile, glanced across at Kenton, who was fixing her with an intensely worried expression that if the circumstances hadn't been so dire, she might have laughed. Their eyes locked together, and as she continued to approach, pace by pace, she lost herself in those soft, brown eyes, steadying her fear, and fortifying her resolve in a way she had never allowed before. Her pulse raced, the bond singing between them in a way that was almost pleasurable. For a moment, it looked like it might actually work. And then, just as she was about to reach him, one of the rebels, a young man Millie hadn't noticed before, lunged forward with a blade aimed at Kenton's back. "No!" Millie screamed. She threw herself forward, shoving the king aside just as the attacker's blade came down. Pain exploded across her side. She heard shouting, felt hands grabbing her, felt the world tilt sideways. And then Kenton's arms were around her, catching her as she fell, and his voice was in her ear, desperate. "Millie, Millie, stay with me." But the edges of her vision were already going dark. The last thing she felt was the bond, blazing bright and fierce between them, pulling her down into the dark. Chapter 8. Millie woke to lamplight and the smell of clean linen. Her side ached, a deep, throbbing pain that sharpened when she tried to move. She winced, and immediately a warm hand was placed on her shoulder. "Don't move," Kenton said. His voice was low, careful, like he was afraid speaking too loudly might hurt her. Her eyes focused slowly. She was back in the camp, in a tent she didn't recognize. Larger than hers had been, with a proper cot and a brazier burning in the corner. Kenton sat beside her, his shirt rumpled, stained with what looked like blood. Her blood, she realized with a jolt. How long had he been sitting there? He reached for a cup of water and helped her sit up enough to drink. His hands were steady, but she could see the tremor in his fingers. "What happened?" she asked. "You saved my life," Kenton said quietly. "Again." He rubbed his face wearily. I thought you were going to die from poison. Like I almost did." "Nightshade isn't dangerous to humans," Millie pointed out kindly. "A bad wound is," Kenton countered, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't quite hiding. "Infected, dirty. Millie, you could have died." The fear in his voice made her chest tighten. She studied his face, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, like he was afraid of what she'd see there. She looked at the way his hand rested near hers on the blanket, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming to save me." "How could I not?" he said, finally meeting her gaze. "Millie, you're my mate. I would have burned the world down to get you back." Her heart stuttered in her chest. The bond hummed between them, warm and insistent, and she felt the echo of his emotion through it, relief and love. "I don't expect you to feel the same," he added quickly, and there was vulnerability in his voice. "I know this bond. I know I can't ask you to accept it just because it exists. But that doesn't change what you are to me." Millie's chest felt too tight. She needed to think, to process, but all she could do was stare at him, at the way he was looking at her. "What happened with the rebels?" she asked, changing the subject before she could do something stupid like cry. Kenton blinked but replied, "Francis and I are working on negotiations. Representatives from both sides, neutral ground, mediators." Millie stared at him. "You and Francis? Working together?" The idea was so absurd she almost laughed. The man who'd burned down her tavern and the man who'd stabbed him with a poisoned blade, sitting down together to negotiate peace. "I meant it when I said I wanted to end this war," Kenton said. "And it seems your friend meant it too." "He's not really my friend anymore," Millie murmured, looking down at the blanket. "That's not the impression I've got of him," Kenton said, his voice gentle. "Since we've been awake, he speaks of little but your kindness at the crossroads, not to mention standing up for you when that rebel had a knife at your throat." Millie thought about Francis, about the betrayal and the years of lies and the fact that, in the end, he'd still tried to protect her. Maybe it did count for something. "You should rest," Kenton said, starting to stand. "I'll let the healer know you're awake." "Wait," Millie said, her hand shooting out to catch his wrist. He froze, half risen from his chair, his eyes dropping to where her fingers wrapped around his arm. "Stay," she said. He sat back down slowly, carefully, like he was afraid any sudden movement might make her change her mind. "I felt you coming," she admitted, her thumb unconsciously stroking the inside of his wrist. "Before I saw you at the exchange. I felt the bond pulling, telling me you were close." She watched his throat work as he swallowed hard. Millie reached for his hand properly, threading her fingers through his. "The bond gets stronger when we're near each other," Kenton said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially in moments of high emotion." "When I was walking toward you," Millie continued, needing him to understand, "and our eyes met. I felt it. I've been feeling it since I first laid my hands on you. And I didn't even like you back then." She snorted, a small, broken sound. "In fact, I kind of hated you." Kenton's breath caught. "Millie!" "I'm still angry about the crossroads," she interrupted, because she needed him to know all of it. "I know," he said. "But I know that when I saw that blade coming toward you, the idea of you dying..." Her voice cracked, and suddenly she was back there, watching the blade arc through the air, knowing she couldn't let it hit him. The terror of that moment crashed over her again, and her hand trembled in his. Kenton leaned forward, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You burned down my home," she said. "You're stubborn and ruthless, and you make terrible decisions when you think you're being practical." She watched his mouth twitch. "But you also know how to admit when you're wrong," she continued softly. Rare in a man. That earned her a real smile, small but genuine. "You spared Francis. You came for me," she finished quietly, pressing his hand to her chest where the bond hummed and sang between them. "I don't know what having a mate means exactly," she said, watching the way hope bloomed in his eyes, the way he seemed to hold his breath waiting for her next words. "But I do know what I feel for you." Kenton stared at her, hope breaking across his face like sunrise. "And what do you feel?" he asked. She rolled her eyes, unable to help the small smile tugging at her lips. "I feel like you're an idiot if you even need to ask," she said, before adding, her voice going soft. "And I also feel like I love you." For a moment, Kenton went perfectly still. His eyes widened, his lips parting in surprise, and she watched the words land. Then his face crumpled, all the careful control he'd been maintaining shattering. "Millie," he breathed. She closed the last of the distance between them and kissed him. This kiss was different from the first. Gentle. Intentional. A choice they were both making with open eyes. His lips moved against hers softly, carefully, as if afraid of breaking her. She felt his hand tremble where it rested against her chest. The bond flared between them, and she felt it filling her with a yearning so profound it was almost painful. She reached up with her free hand and cupped his jaw. "I love you too," he whispered against her lips, his eyes closed, his breathing uneven. "Good," Millie said, her thumb brushing along his cheekbone. "Because you owe me a tavern, and I'm not letting you off the hook so easily." Kenton laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, that shook his shoulders. "I'll build you a dozen taverns if you want them," he said. And the way he looked at her, like she'd just given him the world, made her believe he meant it. "Just one will do," she said, smiling, "but it better have west-facing windows." "For the sunsets," he agreed. And when he kissed her again, slow and sweet and full of promise, she let herself fall completely into it. Into him. Into this impossible bond. Into a future she'd never imagined but suddenly couldn't wait to build. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Would you have saved Kenton if he'd burned your tavern down? Or let karma do its work? I'd love to know what you think. If you liked it, consider hitting the like button, and if you really liked it and want more content, you can subscribe and check out all my other stories. See you next time.